Shabbat Shalom, everybody. A great morning. Such a wonderful energy. It's, again, a privilege to see so many of you, really for the first time in quite a while in the sanctuary. And it elevates, of course, that sense of Kedusha, that sense of holiness in the room. And we're grateful that you came to support the Comer family this morning. I want to share with you three stories. Three stories which all relate not only to each other, but to our Torah portion. The first one, early 1840s. The Russian Rebbe, he flees Russia to escape persecution by the Tsar, and he moves his family to Sadagora, which is in Austria, present-day Austria, and he begins what's called the Sadagora Hasidic dynasty, and it was led by his sons, led by his grandsons, and before World War I, they'd amassed 5,000 followers. 1938, Rabbi Avram Yaakov Friedman, who was the grandson of the first Sadagora Rebbe, he luckily obtains a visa to the geographic area known as Palestine, now Israel, reestablishes his court in Tel Aviv, and of course we know what happens to those that were left behind. Thousands upon thousands of the Sadagora Hasidim murdered in the Holocaust, leaving the Rebbe only a few dozen followers, but he served in Tel Aviv for 22 years until his death, 1961, and he passed away as a revered and celebrated rabbi. And every Yom HaAtzmaut, every Israel Independence Day, this Rebbe, he would make his way to the great synagogue of Tel Aviv. And there he would join with other congregants, praying with this incredible fervor, this incredible joy, almost an ecstasy. And after the services, he would join in the dancing. Throngs of people in the streets of Tel Aviv, clasping their hands, dancing with enthusiasm and happiness. And it was always obvious to everyone that this day was perhaps the most sacred and special day for the Sadagora Rebbe. He felt such joy on Yom HaAtzmaut. And one particular year, one of the Hasidim awoke early, very early on Yom HaAtzmaut, needed to leave his house, decided to go to the great synagogue even before sunrise, and to his great shock, as he's walking, he sees the Sadagora Rebbe, a revered sage, someone who sat upon an intellectual pedestal of piety. And there he is, 4 o'clock in the morning, a broom in his hand, sweeping the streets. And as he's sweeping trash and debris, he's got this huge smile of joy painted on his face. And the man, he approaches the Rebbe. He says, "What are you doing? A man of your stature, 4 a.m., sweeping the streets, dusty, dirt, debris, and with a smile, no less." And the Rebbe looks at him and says, "In March 1938, the Nazis made their names be erased forever, swallowed up Austria. They entered Vienna, and their first move was to degrade all of the Jewish community. And as the rabbi of the Jewish community, they chose me as a symbol, and they gave me a broom, and every day they had me sweep the streets of Vienna. And as I did that work, dusty, debris, trash all over me, tears from all my Hasidim watching, I used to pray, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, may it be your will that I merit to take a broom in my hand and sweep the streets of Eretz Yisrael." And so on Yom HaAtzmaut, I get up at 3 o'clock every morning, and I've done it since the day I arrived here. Yom HaAtzmaut, 3 o'clock in the morning, I take a broom, and with great simcha, great joy, I sweep the streets of my neighborhood, constantly saying, Nitzachnu, Nitzachnu, Nitzachnu. We won, we won, we won. Story number 2. Rabbi B'nai Friedman, and very early mentor and teacher of mine in Israel, he made an aliyah in the early 1980s. He's a decorated soldier and also a revered rabbi in Israel and in the United States. This story is about the family of Chaim Avner, which is a name familiar to Rabbi Friedman for a very long time, but he never really knew who he was, never had the chance to meet him, or to really meet his very special family until one Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day. Now, he'd seen this family before. He even shared some of their most personal and intimate moments, but he never felt it right to approach them, talk to them, didn't want to intrude. You see, Chaim Avner is close to a very close old friend of Rabbi Friedman's. In fact, he's about as close as you can get, because his grave lies next to Rabbi Friedman's dearest friend's grave on Mount Herzl, Israel's national military cemetery. Danny Moschitz, of blessed memory. He is still and will always be 20 years old, which is how old he was when he was killed in an ambush in the Kasmiya Bridge in Lebanon in 1985. He was killed 2 days after Chaim Avner, Zichro Livracha, who was 27. And he was doing a 16-day stint of reserve duty in Lebanon, and a Hezbollah terrorist drove a car bomb and killed him, along with 11 other soldiers on patrol in southern Lebanon. And so every Yom HaZikaron, every Memorial Day in Israel, Rabbi Friedman would grieve alongside the Avner family, including, of course, the mother of Chaim Avner. And as years passed, Mrs. Avner, she grew old and she grew frail. And one year, the rabbi, he worried whether or not they'd share the day again. After all, Mrs. Avner, she'd already reached her 90s. And there was this silent, intimate connection between the two. They shared this moment every year, and the rabbi, he wanted to preserve it. And so as Mrs. Avner hovered over the grave of her son, Rabbi Friedman, standing at a distance, he takes out his phone and he snaps a picture. And as he zooms in on it, to crop it and edit it, he couldn't believe what he'd overlooked all these years. Of course, in the background is the grave of Chaim Avner, his mother standing over him, and there on her forearm are tattooed numbers that he'd never noticed before. Now, the following year, Rabbi Friedman, he approached Yom HaZikaron with this heightened trepidation. He had hoped to see Mrs. Avner, and when she finally arrived, with her usual entourage of family, he was relieved, and she approached, and Rabbi Friedman smiles at her, and he says to her strangely, "Ma shlomech?" And he catches himself at how strange a question it is to ask. He was comforted to see her, but he blurts out, "Ma shlomech, how are you?" To a woman standing over her son's grave with numbers scarred on her arm from the Shoah. What's she supposed to answer? "I'm fine"? The words had already escaped his lips, and they hung awkwardly in the air, and Mrs. Avner looks up and smiles at him, and she says, "Hakol tov, everything is good." How could she respond such a thing? Her son's grave, numbers on her arm, and so B'nai Friedman questioned her. "Again? Yeah? Really?" And she could see he had no idea what to do with a response, so she holds her arm out and she points and she says, "Tirei." And there's a girl standing next to her. "Zod Noah, ta makir? Nina sheli." That's Noah. You know her? That's my great-granddaughter. And then she looks around at her children and her grandchildren and her other great-grandchildren, and she stares at B'nai Friedman and she says, "Nitzachnu, we won." A woman standing on Har Herzl over the grave of her son, numbers tattooed on her arm, says, "Hakol tov, everything is good. Nitzachnu, we won." Story 3. 12 children in a deeply religious family, a remote little village, eastern Romania. Still there today, by the way. The house is gone. So are all the Jews. But the town is there. And these 12 children would grow up in a world foreign to all of us, profoundly observant. The cadence of their life beat to the commandments of the Torah, the tradition of the holidays. The family, they had no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and all you kids listening, they did not have iPads. Nothing like that. The property belonged to the family for a number of generations, and most of their food, it just grew in a garden outside. Now, it was a family of 12 children, but 2 sisters were inseparable. And when old enough, all the siblings, they ventured to large towns. But these sisters, they remained together, always searching for better opportunities until they eventually made it all the way to the big city, Budapest, Hungary. And you can almost imagine them, 18, 19 years old, adventurous, hopeful. They're dancing through life with this sense of invincibility that teenagers have. That sense of invincibility, it only blesses the young. And of course, the Nazis would change all of that. Youthful optimism of city life exchanged for the nightmares of the Budapest ghetto. Now, the Budapest ghetto was not like any others. It wasn't established until November of 1944. The Nazis, they perfected by this point their implementation of the final solution, and Jews were immediately transported to camps once they arrived in the ghetto, including these 2 sisters, Dachau. Now, Now, the winter of 1944 was one of the coldest and most severe on record. Girls braved the elements. They survived, dressed in rags. Hunger, disease, death everywhere. Now, we all know the timeline of the Shoah in hindsight. Of course, it's the winter of 1944. There's hope on the horizon. The girls, of course, didn't know this, especially on a death march. Now, the sisters' love for one another had allowed them to endure the worst of horrors, and the march was no different. One of the sisters, her strength fled her. She crumbles to the ground. The other hoists her up, and as if she was a child, places her feet on top of her own.
I did such a good job.
And literally walks her through the snowy terrain, holding her up like a human puppet. One brave evening, the sisters and 14 others, including 2 young brothers who would become their husbands, they flee. On May 1st, 1945, 76 years almost to the day, these 16 were found by the Americans. Now, Edith, the sister whose strength left her on the death march, she passed away a few years ago. You just heard her great-granddaughter read Torah. Fritzi, the sister who carried her on her own feet through the snowy terrain, she passed away on Tuesday, 99 years old. And we can almost imagine her being reunited with her family in Gan Eden. Her sisters, her siblings, her parents who were killed in Auschwitz, all waiting for her with open arms. And as she walks through the gates of Gan Eden, she looks at them all, knowing what was going to happen today, and says, Nitzachnu, we won. Now, all 3 of these stories have something in common. We just read Achrei Mot Kedoshim. It literally means after the death, Achrei Mot Kedoshim, of the holy ones. After the death of the holy ones. And it outlines this prescription for how we're all supposed to live these righteous lives of holiness and sanctity and moral clarity and goodness. And this prescription, which is long, it's called the Holiness Code. And it starts with 2 directives. Simple. Honor your mother and father. Remember Shabbat. Not, you shall not murder. You should give to the poor. All these other things. Honor your parents. Shabbat. In other words, as Jews, you want to be righteous, holy, acknowledge and have gratitude for where we come from. The narratives, the biographies that funnel through centuries down to parents and eventually to us in this moment in time. And how exactly do we honor our parents? And that tradition? Simple. Shabbat, this all-encompassing directive. It's not just about Friday night and Saturday. Carry the insights, the wisdom of our Torah, the profound ethical imperatives and ambitions of the Jewish people forward in time. And then when it's our time and we walk through the gates of Gan Eden, we'll be able to say the same thing. Nitzachnu, we won. Shabbat shalom, everybody.